So good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Sulpizio, president of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, and I want to welcome you to this month's virtual outing. And this evening, we're very fortunate to have uh, two presenters, two brothers as presenters, which is the first ever for us. Um, they presented their work at the 2023 Grand Canyon uh, History Symposium. So tonight we're going to have both Chris and Richard Thomson present to us early 20th century convergence of opportunity and technology result in historic Grand Canyon photographs. The Grand Canyon Historical Society celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. Also, Grand Canyon Historical Society is the official National Park Service partner for the Grand Canyon for interpretation and educational services. And if you are not a member, please consider joining our organization. We're an all-volunteer organization. Everything we do is out of the passion we have for the region, its history, and to promote activities such as this, which we can share with others. And it's very easy to join, or if you're already a member, you might want to donate. There's the website URL, and you just hit join or donate at the top of the homepage. Super easy. So Tom Thomson has a PhD in microbiology with a postdoctoral training in medical microbiology, public health, and laboratory medicine. He recently retired as director of laboratory medicine, NorthShore University HealthSystem in Evanston, and clinical professor of pathology at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. So continue on the next page. Tom's interest in history and Grand Canyon was helped by his background in science, his tenure as a board member of the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, and 15 years of winter visits to Arizona. Now, Chris Thomson, his brother, has a BA in Fine Art Photography from Rochester Institute of Technology. Chris received a grant in 1976 to restore, duplicate, and preserve the Lucy Burrows Morley, LBM, cellulose nitrate negatives, followed by a show of the LBM collection at the George Eastman House Museum, which is also in Rochester, I believe. A portion of the LBM collection has been shown at the Castle Museum in Saginaw, Michigan, the Interlochen School in Interlochen, Michigan, and the Ann Arbor Library in Ann Arbor. Approximately 50 LBM images have been accepted into the George Eastman House Museum for their permanent collection.
Well, Tom, thank you very much. Chris and I appreciate the invitation to speak to the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And I'd also like to thank Earl Spammer, who edited the proceedings of the 2023 program. And this presentation tonight is an extension of the remarks that I made at that program. This is a picture that is hanging on the wall of the screen porch in our cottage in Michigan. And this picture has been hanging there for decades. And it occurred to me recently that we don't really know the full extent to the history of this picture. You know, where it came from, why it was taken, you know, how somebody got from our family to the Grand Canyon. And Chris and I undertook the steps of looking into the history of this photograph. And we walk by it every day, and sometimes we pay attention to it and sometimes we don't. But if you stand back and look at the photograph, it's actually quite representative of what's happened at the Grand Canyon, you know, over the last 100 years. You know, visitors come, they look over the side, and they take a picture. So tonight what I'd like to do is just describe what we found out about this picture, because it's a wonderful story from many aspects. We discovered that the photograph was taken by our great-grandmother, Lucy Burrows Morley. She and her husband, Ralph Chase Morley, took a trip to the Grand Canyon in 1908, leaving November 17th from Saginaw, Michigan, and traveling for 31 days. Lucy was 37, Ralph was 32. They were married in 1897 and had four children, all born before the trip began. Interestingly, possibly a sign of the times, the fourth child was born in September of 1908, and leaving for their trip 2 months later, they left the 2-month-old child behind in the care of others, and more about that shortly. Accompanying Ralph and Lucy were Ralph's brother, Paul, and his wife, Helen. So the four of them boarded a train in Saginaw and left on their trip. They traveled to the West Coast. They traveled down the West Coast and over to Arizona. They visited the Grand Canyon on December 14th. And Lucy had a Brownie camera recently marketed by George Eastman that she had taken with her. And she took 52 photographs on that trip, one of which was of her brother-in-law and his wife overlooking the South Rim. Fortunately, the entire trip was recorded in our great-grandfather Ralph's travel journal. Every day he wrote down where they went and what they did, allowing us to piece together the entire trip. So how did we find out all this information 100 plus years after it actually happened? Well, there were photographic negatives, there were written travel journals, and there was word of mouth that have been passed through 7 generations of our family. We have a cottage in Michigan that has been inhabited by our family for 150 years, and possessions of all those different generations have been stored in this family through laziness more than intention, and they've all were served as research information for Chris and me when we began to put this story together. Of interest was the time. In addition to having this cottage full of information, the time was important in their lives. For example, the economics of the United States had changed rapidly after the Civil War. So the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought sort of wealth and opportunity to the middle class because of the Industrial Revolution in America that had begun budding after the Civil War. President Teddy Roosevelt encouraged travel and adventure. He founded 5 national parks and 18 national monuments when he was president. One of the national monuments was the Grand Canyon. In addition, there were technological developments. Rail travel throughout the West was expanding rapidly after the connection of the East and the West in 1869, and amateur photography was beginning to take off because of the marketing by George Eastman of film that was on a roll. Prior to that, professional photographers, which abounded and took pictures at the Grand Canyon, applied their emulsion to glass and had a large camera that they had to carry around and then went to the darkroom to develop their pictures. Amateurs were excluded from the photography realm until this film and that emulsion was put on a roll, and George Eastman allowed the amateur photographer to take 100 pictures with the first Brownie camera that came out, send the camera into Eastman Kodak in New York. The pictures were developed, the camera was reloaded, and everything was sent back to the amateur photographer to take another 100 photographs. All of these events focused really in the early 1900s, allowing our great-grandparents to take this trip and take the picture that they did. Here's a self-portrait of Lucy Morley. She has a later model of the Kodak Brownie camera with her. From 1902 to 1924 approximately, she took over 2,000 photographs, of which we have all of those negatives. This is Lucy and Ralph's family. This is after they took their trip, obviously. The children are grown up. Ralph is on the right with the glasses. Lucy is second from the left, and those are her 4 children. 2 points of interest. The young boy on the right is the child that was born 2 months before they left on their 1908 trip. And the gentleman in the middle with the bow tie is Chris and my grandfather. The date of this is probably right before he went to Europe as an ambulance driver for the United States Army in World War I. Again, the reason that this photograph was possible is because of many converging events. As I mentioned, the railroads throughout the West were multiplying rapidly. Amateur photography was now a possibility with the Kodak Brownie camera that came out in 1900. The opening of the Grand Canyon because the accessibility of the Grand Canyon because of the railroad that was put in from Williams to the South Rim in 1901, and then the hotels such as the Altavar that opened in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt encouraging everybody to travel, and also the economy was allowing the middle and upper middle class to have expendable income, and they were able to take advantage of the new railroad system, the cameras, and their curiosity to travel the country. Michigan at the time was just getting over its lumber boom and moving into its manufacturing mode. And banking was present in order to finance the lumbering and also the manufacturing that was beginning. There was mining in Saginaw, the mining of salt. There was mining in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota because of iron ore, and then all the manufacturing that was associated with supporting this industry. Saginaw was a booming town on the western border in the 1800s and then in the early 1900s. The Kodak camera that was introduced in 1900 was a box, and the roll film was on the inside. There were 100 exposures. There was nothing that you could do except push the button to take an exposure and then wind the film to the next exposure and send it off to the company. This was the advertisement for that early Kodak Brownie camera. Of interest here is the negatives for this camera were 2¼ by 2¼ inches, which is a large black and white negative, which allowed all these prints to be, today anyway, to be printed in very large format, as we did, as you saw for the photograph on our screen porch. Later versions of the Kodak Brownie camera allowed the photographer more leverage in the picture they took. They could do exposures and they could do aperture, and they had a flash on it, and this gave the photographer much better ability to take photographs under various conditions. Lucy's photographs were not sophisticated from a scientific standpoint. They simply were from a composition standpoint. Here's a photograph of the two cameras that she used. The one on the left is the Brownie camera first used in the early 1900s, and then later, probably around 1912 or 1915, she started using the so-called Kodak pocket camera. It's a relatively large camera requiring a large pocket, but certainly not iPhone size. Saginaw, Michigan at the time was, as I said, was a booming industrial center. In 1850, there were 2,500 people in Saginaw. In 1880, there were 75,000 people in Saginaw. And it was around 1880 or 1885 where it experienced the peak of its lumber boom. It was a 26th state, and it was brought into the United States in 1837. Interestingly, after an agreement with Ohio to give Ohio some of the land to the south, and in return, Michigan received the Upper Peninsula. And it was at that point that all the arguments were over and it became a state, 1837. The economy was thriving. As I said, there were laborers, investors, financiers, lumber, retail, banking, mining, sugar beet farming. The whole area was rife with opportunity. The Burrows family, Lucy's family, arrived in Saginaw in 1862 and established the George L. Burrows Bank. The Morley family arrived a year later and established Morley Brothers Hardware, two going concerns in a town that was rapidly expanding. This is a picture of the Morley Brothers retail store in the 1800s. It was noted in the newspaper at the time when it opened that it was the second largest retail store with over 100,000 square feet of retail space, second largest retail store in the United States. Presumably something in one of the large cities in the east, such as New York, was larger. But it was a building that was made out of steel and brick and was quite advanced for its time. This is the home that Lucy grew up in Saginaw. You can see she's there with 3 of her 4 sisters. Somebody must have just had a birthday because they got a new car out in front, at least the best car they could have at the time, a horse. These are the 5 sisters, and I show this because 3 of the sisters married and established cottages at Higgins Lake. And to this day, still 70% of the cottages, there are 35 of them in the association, are owned by Burrows and Morley family members. Lucy Morley is on the left. Higgins became a part of the family in 1876. Saginaw was a swampy, mosquito-infested town that was hot and humid during the summer, and a mere 100 miles north, there was a different climate. There were many inland lakes, and if you traveled to one of these lakes, you were rewarded with lower temperatures, fewer mosquitoes, and a much more relaxing summer. So in the latter half of the 1800s, railroads were put in place to train up the laborers to work in the lumber, to work in the forests, and then they were used to bring the lumber back down to the mills in the south. And soon families began to attach train cars to the back of these lumber trains, and they would pull them north to the beautiful lakes that dot most of the lower peninsula of Michigan in that particular area. The Burrows family settled on Higgins Lake in 1876, and it's that exact spot that the Burrows and Morleys have had 7 generations of families pass through all of these cottages. Each cottage served as a repository of generational droppings, and through coincidence more than design, various possessions were left in cabinets. So in our cottage, for example, there are many drawers and cabinets in each of the bedrooms. There's 5 bedrooms in the cottage, and above the cabinets there are deep storage areas that nobody can reach into, let alone see into. So for generations, things would be put up there and forgotten. And it wasn't until our generation that we began sorting through all of these deep cupboards and came across all the history of our family. And in these historical findings, there were handwritten journals. It's remarkable. There's probably 30 different journals from generations dating back to George Burrows and Edward Morley, the mid to late 1800s. We have journals from World War II. We have my grandfather's journal when he drove the ambulance in World War I. And fortunately, we had a 2008 journal from my great-grandfather that documented the trip, the 31-day trip to the West Coast by train every single day. Importantly, what was left in the cottage were photographic negatives and this 1908 journal. It made me reflect as I looked at all of these possessions that are still around, that all of the information that we have as part of our generation is really electronic. And you won't find these in the back of cupboards or in basements or someplace that they can be pulled out and gone through. I'm not quite sure how we're going to leave all of our memorabilia to subsequent generations, since it's all on different computers and on different hard drives and different memory sticks. That will be a challenge. The settlements at Higgins Lake started at tents in 1876. So each summer they would go up and they would pitch their tents, and then they would spend 2 or 3 months on the shores of this beautiful lake with the families. Following the tents, they built log cabins, and this is one of the first log cabin that was built. And interestingly, this log cabin still exists. You can see when it was built on the right in the mid-18 to late 1800s. And then on the left, that's a picture that was just taken recently of the same log cabin. Following log cabins, they began to build frame homes. You can see the house in the background here. This is the cottage that Lucy Morley, who's lying in the hammock, spent all of her summers in. This cottage is right next door to where I'm sitting right now, and fortunately or unfortunately, it looks almost the same. It really is one of the oldest cottages in the association and hasn't had much done to it for well over 100 years. Next to that cottage is this old cottage, and this, when Lucy and Ralph married in 1898, they bought this cottage and came up and spent summers here until 1922, when a tree fell on this cottage and destroyed it, and it was rebuilt. I'm not sure if you can see the sign hanging over the front door. The sign says Nagamoqua. This was the name given Lucy Morley, my great-grandmother, by the local Chippewa natives because she whistled, and that is Chippewa for whistling girl. In 1923, this cottage replaced that early one that was destroyed in the storm, and this cottage today is exactly the same. It still exists, and this is where all of the memorabilia was uncovered that we came across. So since 1922, we've all gone up to the lake and spent our summers in this particular cottage. A current photograph of the cottage is right here from the front. So to my back, I took this picture is the lake, and this is a cottage that has 5 bedrooms. When it was first built, it had 1 bathroom, presumably because what preceded it was a 3 or 4 bedroom cottage that had 1 outhouse out back. And why do you need more than 1 outhouse? We're simply bringing it inside so that it had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom for the 5 bedrooms. It now has 3 bathrooms. We've modernized that to some extent. And back then, everybody cleaned up in the lake. Now we have showers and are able to clean up in the house. But this is the repository for all of the historic information that Chris and I were able to uncover about the trip that Lucy and Ralph took and the photograph that she took at the Grand Canyon. There are leather-bound travel journals that date back to 1874. Here's Edward Morley's monthly listing of the sales for the Morley Brothers department store, and we have all of these journals now in a book cabinet in the front of that cottage. And to this day, we still haven't read through all of them. It's a lot to read, and it's also a lot of handwriting to interpret. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now for a short bit, because this bedroom in the front cottage, you can see the arrow is pointing toward a closet that is cut out from the wall, and this closet is positioned over a stairwell, and the closet was always behind a bed. A bed was pushed up against the wall, and literally we never looked in this closet for generations, and fortunately one day Chris and his brother did. So Chris, let me turn it over to you and tell us about your finding.
Okay. Tom, I call that a cupboard, not a closet, because that did not go all the way down to the floor.
Right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris, Tom's brother. I'm 73 years old, and I want to tell you about a summer afternoon that changed my life. Generations of my family have grown up at Higgins Lake in northern Michigan. My great-great-grandfather, George Burrows, discovered and purchased lakeside land on Higgins Lake in 1876. In 1921, Tommy says it's 22, a falling tree hit the original cottage. They moved it to the back lot and rebuilt it. Then they built a brand new cottage up front. That front cottage is where I grew up every summer. In 1974, I was home on vacation from Rochester Institute of Technology, the school I was going to, where I was studying fine art photography. My younger brother, Stuart, and I were up north at the cottage cleaning out closets for my mother, Lucy Morley Thomson. And there in a closet in the front cottage, we found a box of negatives. We had no idea what we were holding. I took the negatives back to Rochester and started printing them. When I showed them to my photography teachers, they stopped cold. They were impressed, genuinely impressed. One of them said, "You could teach an entire course of composition with these photographs." I was offered at that time a full-time job at the photo school at RIT. So I dropped out of school and I worked for RIT, and the next year I printed a lot of these negatives. The George Eastman House saw the work and they loved it. I was offered a grant from the Morley Foundation to restore the negatives. That's when I found out that the images were captured on cellulose nitrate film. Beautiful to print from, but dangerous beyond measure. The cellulose nitrate negatives will spontaneously combust at 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Those famous Hollywood film warehouses fires in early 20th century Southern California started with stored nitrate film baking in the summer heat. The cottage negatives had been sitting in a dry, cool closet or cupboard for 50 years, which is likely what saved them and the cottage. I restored the negatives by making copies of each one onto modern, what they call safety film, preserving every image for the future. The photographer was my great-grandmother, Lucy Burrows Morley. I never knew her. She died in 1948, and I was born in 53. But I did know her husband, Ralph, who lived until like 63. So I knew him as a young boy. Lucy Burrows Morley was born on Christmas Day in 1871. She picked up a Brownie camera in 1902 and made just under 2,000 photographs before she put it down in 1924. In 1976, I had a show of her prints at the George Eastman House Gallery. Today, more than 200 of her images are in their permanent collection. I am currently holding a show of hers with 40 photographs. And this show is available to anybody that has a gallery or any school, any library that wants to show it. We will box it up and ship it out. You hang it for a month or whatever long the show is, and then box it up and ship it back. I'm sure we can find a way to pay for that shipping. It's a shatterproof glass, and the show is really good. It's her best images, one of which is this Grand Canyon shot that we're going over today. So I thank everybody for this opportunity to share my story. Tom, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Wonderful. Really good. Lucy Burrows Morley was a photographer, but she wasn't a technical photographer. She had an artistic bent. She played the harp. She played the organ. She sang and she whistled, hence the name Nagamokwa. As I mentioned, her father, George Burrows, met George Eastman during his travels, and George Eastman convinced George Burrows to invest in Eastman Kodak. This is presumably in the 1890s. As a result of that, Lucy was purchased or was given a Kodak Brownie camera soon after they came out in 1900. She was not a technically sophisticated photographer, but she did have an eye for composition, and she did travel worldwide, taking pictures really of everyday life at a time when photography by amateurs was quite unique. As mentioned by Chris, there are some of her photographs that have been put in the permanent collection of the George Eastman Museum. Here's a picture of Lucy Morley playing the harp on the front path in front of the cottages on Higgins Lake. On the right, she's playing the organ in their house in Saginaw, a means of entertaining people who came over for dinner. One of the interesting traits that she had when she photographed was to take panoramic views with people standing in the foreground, and you look at the back of the people looking at what the people were looking at. And if you think of the Grand Canyon photograph, it was just an extension of this method that she used commonly as she took her photographs. Ralph Morley, her husband, kept this handwritten journal of the entire trip, writing in the journal every single day during the 31 days. This journal was not discovered until 2023 when we were preparing our presentation for the Grand Canyon Symposium. According to this journal, they traveled from Saginaw to Chicago, to St. Paul, Minnesota, across Montana to Tacoma, Seattle, and Vancouver, where they visited friends and actually visited a sawmill that the family owned in the state of Washington. From Seattle, they went down to Portland and then to Fresno, Los Angeles, and San Diego. In Southern California, they traveled by automobile to Santa Ana, La Jolla, Redlands, Riverside, and Pasadena. Quite a trip for 1908. They left Pasadena on December 13th for the Grand Canyon. This is the 1908 journal of my great-grandfather's. As we rescued it, you can see that it's covered with mold at the top, and the mice were chewing away at the bottom, so rescued just in time. to be able to read all of his entries. This is a map of the railroad system in 1908, and the red is the trek that they took from Michigan on the right-hand side, across the upper Midwest to Washington State, down to San Diego, and then back with a little spur up to Grand Canyon, and then back to Saginaw. Took them 31 days. They traveled 5,000 miles, and this was a mere 100 years after it took Lewis and Clark, 2 years to get from St. Louis out to the Pacific Ocean and back. Here's a picture of the traveling group that was taken in near Vancouver. Ralph is on the left, his brother Paul is on the right, and then Paul's wife is in the middle, presumably with the headwear of the day. This is the train that they took from Portland down to California. Here they are in Southern California. I'm not sure who the three gentlemen are. It looks to me like the Marx Brothers, but it could have been someone in their traveling party. But there are the beaches of Southern California. Here they are in a car driving around Southern California. There are three of the people traveling on the trip, and then there's an extra gentleman that they picked up in Washington that took part of the rest of the trip with them. This is the 1908 journal. They arrived at the Grand Canyon on December 14th, and later that day, on December 14th, Lucy took the photograph overlooking the South Rim. We were able to walk the rim and figure out through comparing the geographic formations in the horizon exactly where it was taken, and it was taken at Hopi Point. In the journal, Ralph wrote that Lucy and Mary, we're assuming Mary is Paul's wife, that was her middle name. And then Claire, we don't know who Claire was, but Ralph said that they made the trip to the river, which they did not go all the way down to the river, they just made it to the edge. But it was very wonderful and very beautiful. This is the photograph that she made, and I can tell you that 3 trips to the South Rim, we knew that it was from Hopi Point because of the geology in the background there, but we were never able to find the exact spot along that around Hopi Point where this photograph was taken. Again, we could line up the geography, the geology, and know that approximately where it was taken, but that exact spot, which has a few little markers on the ground there that we thought we would be able to find, but we never were until Earl Spammer and his wife Jane went and dedicated themselves to finding this spot. And my understanding is that Jane found the rock that's in the picture. As you can see here, it's outside the fence today for safety reasons, but that exact spot with that rock is still present on the edge of the South Rim. You can see that Paul is holding his wife. They're outside today's fence, so they're probably pretty close to the edge there. And they're observing, some formation far off in the canyon. On December 15th, Ralph got up with his brother-in-law and they took a mule ride. This is the Altavar Hotel, where Lucy snapped a picture of them riding past the front of the hotel. Later that day, they got on the train. They went to Albuquerque, Chicago, and Saginaw. They arrived home on December 19th. And in the journal for December 19th, Ralph wrote that the baby had grown very much. Their 2-month-old baby was now 3 months old. A different time. Ralph and Paul and their friend from Washington took a guided trip partially down Bright Angel Trail on mules, and this, I think, is a professional photograph taken, by the people at the Grand Canyon there. This was sort of in their pile of saved things. The guide is in front. Ralph is second from the rear. Paul is third from the rear. And the second person in line there is the man from the state of Washington. So really what we've surmised, I think in quite a lot of detail, is that in 1908, Lucy Burrows Morley photographed two of her family companions overlooking the south rim of the Grand Canyon. The reason that this photograph came to be is because of all the coincidences that focused on the early 20th century in the United States, economic, social, and technological changes that were occurring around the country. Lucy Morley died in 1948 at the age of 77. The Grand Canyon photograph was discovered by my brother in 1974. Ralph Morley died in 1962 at the age of 86. His travel journal was discovered in 2023. All of this information was available to us because, one cottage or a few cottages built on the same lot in the same association existed through 7 generations of our family, and people didn't throw things away. I think, from what I've been able to tell, that this photograph by Lucy is one of the first that still exists of tourists, taken by an amateur, of tourists overlooking the Grand Canyon that really still exists out of the many billions that have followed. It's progressed from this box Brownie camera to the iPhone. And so many of the photographs are taken today, but this one that we're showing you dates back to some of the first that were taken by amateurs who traveled to see the canyon. One of the things that I've learned doing this project is that there is so much history that is uncovered. We all have history that's lurking somewhere, and it can be uncovered if we take the time and have the curiosity to actually look for it. So I thank all of you for your attention, and Tom, Chris, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you guys happen to have.
Tom, I got one thing I'd like to add if I could.
Sure.
That collection that I have for a show of 40 photographs, you can go to Facebook, and under my name, Chris Thomson, you can view a PDF file of each one of the photographs in the show. So if you're
Great.
interested in the show, you can see it on Facebook.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So
Thank
Tom,
you,
I'll turn
Chris.
it back to you. And thank you once again for the opportunity to describe this photograph and how it came to be.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
No, thanks. Our thanks are to you for such a wonderful presentation and an example of discovering family archives as it relates to many historical events. You laid that out very nicely in the history of your family. If you would stop sharing, we'll get a little bit bigger screen visibility of all of us. The one thing I was surprised when we discussed this before the presentation tonight was the relationship with Lucy and your family, because it's easy to miss. And everyone, by the way, if you want to read the historical Grand Canyon Historical Symposium version of this has been expanded, by the way, from what was in the proceedings. But if you want to read and see the photos, in addition to, of course, this video will be available on demand as soon as we finish tonight. What's interesting is that I didn't realize, because you were so I guess nondescript, or kept it kind of as a under one's breath sort of a statement. You basically only said that Lucy was your great grandmother by saying in which 115 years later, her great grandson found the location at which the photograph was taken. That's the only reference we have in your paper that this is your family heritage, your family genealogy. So your presentation illuminated your family so much more. But of course, you only had 20 minutes in our symposium format, as opposed to about 40 minutes. So that was one thing I wanted to observe, that I was surprised when you mentioned the relationship. I'm so pleased to see that, because I love genealogy myself, and what you've described as the history of a family with great roots in the state of Michigan. We probably have most of the residents of Higgins Lake on our YouTube channel this evening. Hopefully we did. We had a very large audience. We still do. And I want to turn over, I mean, that was my comment. I guess in terms of questions, I would ask of the 2,000 plus photos or negatives. First of all, Chris, did you have any accidents with the cellulose nitrate negatives?
I did, yes.
Mm,
When I was doing a contact print, I was using a very heated lamp
hmm
to make the contact print. And after like 30 to 45 seconds,
hmm
it blew up inside the contact frame. And
Okay.
I still have the blown up negative. I saved that in a plastic bag. But luckily, I had printed and copied that negative before that happened.
Do you have all these negatives in some sort of temperature controlled storage unit?
I store them in my house, in my closet, in a plastic box.
hmm
It's very dry and very cool.
In
And I
South
have
Carolina?
all the cellulose nitrate negatives are in a sleeve
Okay.
that is acid free, and there's only one in a sleeve. So I have them all filed in acid uh, free, what is it? Acid free envelopes.
But
They're stored in.
you've made safe negatives of everything.
Yes, I store the two. Each one is in a different sleeve, but I store them all together like that. And I haven't decided what I'm going to do.
hmm
When I pass away, where do they go? And no one's going to be able to insure those, I don't think. If they take them into like a museum or something,
Uh-huh.
I can't throw them away. People have told me to do that, but I haven't done it yet.
No, you would never throw them away. That's sacrilegious to a historical society.
So Tom, Chris's description of his storing these negatives reminds me that Lucy Burrows Morley left these negatives in chronological order.
Mhm.
So they were all stored in the order they were taken. So when I matched up the negatives to the trip log that her husband wrote, I
Mhm.
knew what pictures she took on what days. I knew the first picture she took on the trip and the last picture she took on the trip, and I was able to compile them in a sequence because she was so organized when she left him.
Both of you were born when your great grandfather passed away. He passed away in the 1960s.
Yes.
You're so
Yeah.
fortunate to have a great grandparent you actually got to meet, albeit as a child. Um, I'm going to turn over to, I know Wayne has a question, and Davey, do you have any questions from our YouTube audience?
Hi, one question is from Stephanie Turner. Has the family thought about recreating the trip?
The shop, as
So,
in the department store?
yeah,
Re- yeah,
we do a lot of
recreating.
traveling. We do a lot of traveling. I do a lot of traveling with my wife, but we have not made the decision that we're going to recreate this trip. Actually, it would be sort of interesting to do that. I don't know about Chris.
Mhm.
I've never thought about it. No.
Yeah.
Presumably they went to Grand Canyon with the Williams to Grand Canyon Railroad, which was Santa Fe at that time.
Yes,
Uh,
we have a couple pictures she took out the window of the train.
mhm. It's only well, in those days it was probably 2 hours. It's a 1 hour drive. I mean, I make it all the time.
Yeah,
You know,
So,
be-
yeah.
Before we found this journal, I was under the understanding that she had taken a train across Canada because I
mhm,
have pictures that she took at Lake Louise
mhm.
and Vancouver. And I
Yeah,
thought for sure that trip did it. But Tommy, through the journal, discovered no, they went through the States. They
I
didn't do
see.
that. So they must have had another time going across Canada.
So I asked you this because I'm thinking what you said, Chris, about a museum exhibit. We're always interested in hosting, sponsoring, promoting exhibits. It's something we'd like to grow into as part of our education and enjoyment charter. There is a museum that just reopened in Flagstaff. It's uh, the Northern Arizona Pioneers Museum. It's part of the Arizona Historical Society, of which we're an affiliate member. And the museum manager is a member of the Historical Society. So I asked you how many of these photos would be, let's say, Arizona specific, because it could be from when your family crossed the border at Barstow or whenever they came across the border and then into northern Arizona up to the Grand
I
Canyon.
think there's only one, and that's the photograph we're showing now of the Grand Canyon.
Well,
The
there
one
were,
that-
Chris, there were a
in
couple
that show,
photographs
there's
on the
one in
train.
Arizona.
There were a
And the
couple
ones on the
photographs
train.
on the train going north. So there's maybe a half a dozen that are in
Mhm.
Arizona.
And then the mule is probably the Cole brothers. They were the photographers at the time. Certainly right, Davy in 1908, they were definitely the photographers doing everything.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a note at the top when it was taken. They missed, I think it was when they arrived as the date, but
Mhm.
the picture was actually taken a day later.
Okay. Well, our if we're going to a broader audience in northern Arizona, they would be interested. It would be compelling to put an exhibit of her photography, classic photography, and the story about the photography if there were more images of northern Arizona, which would be the basis for us to get space in a museum. But we can have follow-up discussions about that. We don't have to,
Yeah,
review.
Tommy's talk includes, like he said, a half a dozen or more photos
Mhm.
from the Arizona region. But
Yeah.
my show right now only has that one from Arizona.
And Arizona was a territory, I believe, until 1909, and Wayne would know this better than I, 1909 or 1911. And by the way, Grand Canyon did not become a national park. It was a national monument until 1919. So she and your great grandfather, strange talking about her husband, quote unquote, her husband, it's your great grandfather. Your two great grandparents went there when before it became a national park.
Yeah, that's right.
Wayne
I
has
have
a
a
Before it
que-
was a
I have a
state.
question for
Wayne has a question.
yeah, for Tom Thompson.
Yep.
What is the most recent journal that was found? I'm asking that because presumably that person would have known about the journal stash.
Mhm.
So the most recent journal was a journal that my great grandfather, Ralph Morley, kept during World War II. And when I read through that journal, he makes a notation in there on the day, about a week, my father was shot down um, over Germany
Mm.
on April 12th. And a month later, or a week later, he wrote in the journal that they had been notified that he was missing in action.
Mhm.
And then 2 months after that, they were notified that he was alive. And he made notations in his journal that was from 1944. And that's about the last journal, the latest of the journals, Wayne, that we have. Um, my grandfather wrote journals too, but they didn't extend that long. He pretty much stopped when he got married.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say to both you and Chris, I hope that all of the journals and all the photographs can somehow be archivally
Mhm.
preserved. And I just want to say this is one of the most superbly presented virtual outings that I've seen with the Historical Society. Thank you both very much.
It
Thank
was
Thank
you.
you.
wonderful. Wonderful. So what we're going to do is